Now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Mark Dennis, our curator at the Museum of Freemasonry. And Mark will be giving us a talk about a very interesting man indeed, John, the first Duke of Montagu. And we're very excited to hear more, Mark, so over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jane. He's actually the second Duke, so don't believe everything you read in the papers. If you'd been walking in Covent Garden on a chilly January night in 1749, you might have found a rather remarkable way to warm yourself up. Outside the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, a bonfire was raging, and if you got a bit closer, you discovered it was actually made from the bench seats of the theatre and topped by the theatre's curtain on a pole, and all around chaos. People with their wigs missing, and even the Duke of Cumberland, son of the king, raging that somebody had stolen his sword. The reason? A fraud, which is actually alluded to in this print of the cross-dressing Chevalier d'Eon, who was, again, also a Freemason. A performance had been advertised. A man would place himself into a quart bottle and be passed around the audience. When the man failed to appear, the audience began to become restive. Then a suggestion was made that if they came back the next night, they would see him put himself into a pint bottle instead, and a riot instantly broke out. It will perhaps not surprise you to find this was all caused by the subject of this talk, John, 2nd Duke of Montagu, who had allegedly said while drinking with his friends a few days before, "I wager that if somebody were to brew it about that he could do the most impossible thing in the world, he would find fools enough to London to fill a playhouse who would think him earnest." Well, he won his bet. Then as now, fake news works. And it was all very in character for a man whose mother-in-law would later say, all his talents lie in things only natural in boys of 15 years old, and he is about 52. To get people into his garden and wet them with squirts, and to invite people to his country houses and put things in beds to make them itch. So far, pretty unpromising, and given John's parentage, entirely logical. His father, Ralph, the first Duke, was called by the satirist Jonathan Swift as an arrant knave as any in his time. He'd actually courted his second wife, the Duchess of Albemarle, disguised as the Emperor of China, of all things, because she'd sworn she'd only remarry royalty. And John Montagu, seen here as a young man, grew up in Montagu House in London, later the first home of the British Museum, surrounded by his father's cronies and hangers-on. William Stukeley later remarked that John had had a heathen upbringing. This was, however, just one side to John Montagu, a man of humanity as well as humour, who lived a remarkable and diverse life in the early years of the 18th century. He was not able to go on the grand tour to Europe, but read widely and took an interest in antiquarianism and science. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1718, and that let him mix with his fellows, including the antiquarian William Stukeley, the numismatist, mathematician and astronomer Martin Fawkes, and Dr. Desaguliers, pupil of Isaac Newton. All of them were or became Freemasons, as did John. He allowed experiments in his house, and later also became a Fellow of the College of Physicians, attending annual dinners, and also some of the annual lectures, known as the Harveian Orations, in Latin. In all of this, he was very much the Renaissance man of the 1700s, although Stukeley later remarked of him that he was not a scholar. As a young man, he joined the Duke of Marlborough on his campaign in the Low Countries and was present at the bloody siege of Menin. This seems not to have been a life that suited him, as he returned relatively quickly and he never saw combat again. He clearly made his mark with the Duke, though, as John was married to Marlborough's fourth daughter, Mary. They must have been a stylish couple. Mary was a noted society beauty, and Montagu was described by William Stukeley as very tall in stature, of a good shape and symmetry. His aspect was grand, manly, and full of dignity. His carriage, genteel and polite. He appeared rather gracefully on horseback. It was, it must be said, a fairly open marriage, and Mary was rumoured to have had a number of close friends, allegedly including Queen Anne. In any event, John began to receive honours from the Hanoverian monarchy and became central to the courts of both King George I and II, he was created a Knight of the Garter in 1719, and in 1725 became the first Great Master of the Order of the Bath. On the left, there he is in his garter robes, and on the right, the star of this completely new order. It was a revived knighthood, and it was intended to affirm the legitimacy of the relatively new House of Hanover. His motto, Tria Juncta in Uno, 3 joined in 1, reflected the recent union of England and Scotland, and either the connection to Ireland, or more possibly, the continuing claim to the throne of France. So John was very much at the centre of everything, and these knighthoods were no small thing. Today, when we see the honours list, we're used to hundreds and thousands of people getting honours. It was barely 24 knights for the Garter, and about the same for the Bath. So this was very, very rarefied. His court appointments and honours included being High Constable at the coronation of King George I, and carrying the cross and sceptre at the coronation of King George II. Honours followed colonelcies of regiments, Governor of the Isle of Wight, Chief Falconer, Keeper of the Wardrobe. In around 1719, John became a Freemason. We don't know exactly when, but Dr. Desaguliers seems to have introduced members to Freemasonry privately while Grand Master. And given their friendship, that's as likely a time as any. He's on the left of this picture, the frontispiece to the Constitutions of 1723, receiving a copy of the document from his successor, Philip, Duke of Wharton. He was an active Freemason. He became Grand Master in 1721, subsequently attending the installation of a number of his successors. It was in his year of office that the very first procession of Grand Lodge happened. And also during his year, he was instrumental in the creation of the constitutions. I won't go into more detail about this print because you will hear from our librarian, Martin Cherry, about this frontispiece later on in the series. The record of his first meeting after his installation as Grand Master notes that His Grace's worship and the lodge, finding fault with all the copies of the old Gothic constitutions, ordered Brother James Anderson to digest the same in a new and better method. By the next meeting, he decided to appoint 14 learned brothers to examine Brother Anderson's manuscript of the Constitution book and to make report. Finally, still in his year of office, on the 25th of March 1722, the constitutions were approved and ordered by Montague to be printed. It was a pivotal moment in English and indeed later in Freemasonry around the world, as this document is the basis of modern organised Freemasonry. The constitutions were dedicated to John Montague, and these are his actual personal copy. You can see his crest and his bookplate. What was he like? One of the troubles we've got about Montague's Grand Mastership is it happened before the minute books. There's one description of a Grand Lodge feast in, could be 1720, 21, contained in a contemporary publication, which is rather charmingly entitled In Praise of Drunkenness. It's quite a good read. The feast is described along with the wines and the food, including a wall of venison patties. And the writer is amazed to find no politics is being discussed, unlike in just about every other coffee house and salon in London, because then as now, discussion of what might divide rather than unite is forbidden at meetings of Freemasons. Then there's trouble. One of the diners calls for the tune When the King Enjoys His Own Again. Now that was a popular song for royalists when King Charles II was in exile. And so at this time, it was probably referencing Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite King over the water. Immediately, though, another voice calms the storm. And this is almost certainly John Montague, who every time you run into him seems to have been the man that moderated things, the man that organised. He may also have been the first recorded Freemason to lay a foundation stone. At St. Martin in the Fields, the first foundation stone had been laid by a representative of King George. But in Mist's Weekly Journal of May 1722, they note that a second stone was laid by the Freemasons 12 feet above the first and embedded inside the wall. It's not mentioned in the constitutions, but if it happened, it was almost certainly John that performed the ceremony, reinforcing the right of Freemasons to carry out that ceremony in public and to become part of the streetscape of London, letting people see Freemasonry for the first time. The final mention of him in the minutes of Grand Lodge show him joining the newly formed Committee of Charity in 1725, and as we'll see later, this was very much in character for him. John's membership and Grand Mastership had two longer-term impacts. Firstly, this relatively new organisation became fashionable with the middle classes, who flocked to join the aristocracy in membership. Secondly, any notion that the Freemasons might be spreading sedition or support for the Jacobites was neutered by the membership of a close friend of the king. John's membership thus set Freemasonry up for its expansion in the rest of the century, free, in England at least, from any suspicion of conspiracy or impropriety. So, from joker to a steady pair of hands in court and Freemasonry. But John was a man of his time, and rather less to his credit for modern eyes, he petitioned George I for a colonial governorship. This was a way, perhaps the only way, for aristocrats to make money, and John clearly felt that with his organisational skills, he could make it a success. He began the construction of Montague Town on the Beaulieu River in Hampshire as the place where his cargoes would land and a prosperous community would arise. He equipped a small fleet of ships, including one named the Charles and Freemason, prepared them with cannons, muskets, and even experimental machine guns known as puckle guns. Alas for John, the expedition was doomed from the start, because the colony gifted to him was the island of St. Lucia, there on the left. There were two immediate issues. The island saw itself as neutral, but under the protection of France, and the nearest British garrison was 3 times as far away as the French garrison at Martinique. So the expedition sailed, it arrived, and discovered, thank you very much, the local people had no wish to be colonised by the British, and the British troops and ships in Barbados were not inclined to risk their position by travelling to St. Lucia. John's crew stayed on the island just long enough to celebrate Christmas, when a large French force of several thousand men arrived and very gently suggested it was time to leave. John lost an immense fortune in the venture, around £40,000, and that's the equivalent of over £9 million now. Montague Town never got built, but there is one memory that remains. On the right, the village of Buckler's Heart in Hampshire, which is on the site. The sloping street that had been made to allow the gentry to promenade and the cargoes to be landed proved perfect for shipbuilding. And for many years, the village had a thriving industry, building many vessels, including Lord Nelson's favourite ship, the Agamemnon. But in parallel to his colonial exploits, John once again surprises by providing active support and education for several black men in England. He first supported the servant of his wife, Ignatius Sancho, on the right, giving him access to books and letting him talk to the visitors to Montague House. Sancho, of course, later became famous in his own right, and there's a good summary of his life on the British Library website. The first person of African descent to vote in a British general election, the first to have an obituary published in the English newspapers. And clearly Montague can claim no credit for his later achievements, which were many. But being in the Montague household gave Sancho access to society, and even to have his portrait painted by Gainsborough at the same time as the Duchess. It certainly won't have helped. It would have helped. The second documented case is that of a freed slave, known at the time of Job Ben Solomon, but whose actual name was Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, a Muslim prince, and he's on the left. He'd already been freed when he arrived in England, and by the intervention of Sir Hans Sloane, was actually presented to the king at court. That evening, he dined with a number of the aristocracy, including John Montague. And after that, John took him into the country a number of times, showing him how British agriculture had evolved. It's a real shame that no record of their conversations survive, as this may well have been John's closest friendship outside of his own culture, and I wonder what they discussed. Were these the only examples? Well, there is a record in an 18th century source that he also funded the education at grammar school in Cambridge of a black Jamaican, Francis Williams, who again had a remarkable life. I'm finding that a lot of historians are now doubting this because his name doesn't appear in the rolls at Cambridge. But I certainly think that Montague supported him, at least at school, because in the Northamptonshire Record Office, when I did my research a few years ago, I noted regular sums of 9 guineas being paid out for educating, quote, the black boy. And that's almost certainly Williams. And of course, that's exactly the date when he's becoming a colonial governor. So, good grief. On one hand, the colonist, on the other, the liberal educator. John was very involved in acts of charity, which of course is one of the things that are central to Freemasonry. And this medal, produced in his memory, shows him on the front, symbolically in a suit of armour with the Garter star. But on the back, the story of the Good Samaritan from the Bible, saying, "Do likewise." He was one of the first governors of the Foundling Hospital, and at the time of his death, he was supporting over 40 individuals. A contemporary quote was that he had other pretty fancies. He did good without ostentation. His vast benevolence of soul is not recorded by Pope, but it will be remembered while there is any tradition of human kindness or charity in England. I've mentioned his house in London, Montague House, but it wasn't his love or his favourite home. Boughton House in Northamptonshire was where he mostly preferred to live. But it wasn't the house that his actual interest was. His dad had built it, and he completed it with what's now called the unfinished wing, for good reason, because even now it only has a roof and a facade, so it looks fantastic from the outside, but inside it's just a dusty shell. His real love was the grounds. He planted 70 miles of tree-lined avenues of lime and elm. It was his dream to finally have an avenue of trees all the way from his home to London, but negotiating with all the landowners proved one task too much even for him. Locally, he's still known as John the Planter, and while the elms died last century, the limes are still there. And a lion. Why? Well, that'll become clear shortly. John was also an animal lover, apparently always surrounded by dogs, with his particular favourite being an ugly one that no one else would befriend. He created an animal sanctuary for horses and donkeys to rest after their working lives, and that was very unusual in a society where they would normally be slaughtered and fed to dogs, their bones boiled down for glue. This love of animals meant that he actually left money for their care in his will. And one of my favourite stories, and one of the only quotes we actually get from the man, is that while he was writing the codicil to the will that would actually let the money be given to the animals, he was with the diarist Horace Walpole. And he remembered that while John was writing, a cat jumped on his knee. And he simply picked it up and gently put it on the floor, saying, "What? Have you a mind to be a witness too? You can't, for you are a party concerned." And the lion? Well, this is a modern chicken wire statue at the Tower of London, in commemoration of the menagerie of exotic animals that was once kept there. John visited, and he took pity on a toothless and aged lion. He returned it to Boughton, where it lived in a special house near the pantry, and the instructions for its care survive. It was to be fed on meat, but not horse meat, and no bones, fresh water in its trough daily, and to roam as it desired, but not into the garden in case it drowned itself in the pond. In later life, Montague's military career returned, but in an administrative form. He became Master General of the Ordnance, responsible for all the fortifications, gunpowder, and cannons of the kingdom. This was a complex task, and there was also a great risk of fraud, so Montague's administrative skills came to the fore again. In 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie invaded with a Jacobite army to conquer Britain, and Montague was offered command of the government Hanoverian army. He declined, because of lack of experience, but maybe he'd already seen enough of battles in his youth. He did raise a regiment, Montague's Carbineers, to fight in the war. This was disbanded after the crisis passed, but its troops are noted to have remained very proud of their service to the Duke many years after. And one of the great forgotten what-ifs of history is whether the Duke should have taken the command offered. If he'd failed, of course, there would have been a very different future for the country under a Stuart king. But if he had succeeded, he was far too humane to have carried out the Highland clearances that so poisoned relations between England and Scotland. The end for John Montague came unexpectedly. He became ill with a violent fever and rapidly succumbed to it, dying on the 6th of July, 1749. His friend Stukely wrote in his diary of walking to the Castle pub in Kentish Town with Martin Fawkes to pay their last respects by raising a glass or several. In the distance, the guns of the Tower of London sounded, much as the minute guns did at the funeral of Prince Philip this year. As the hearse passed, Stukely threw onto it honeysuckle flowers from the hedgerows and mused on the fact that this melancholy sight happened less than a year after I went this same road to Boughton, sitting at his left hand. Montagu's widow approached his fellow Freemasons and Royal Society friends, Stukely and Fawkes, for options for a monument. In the end, Martin Fawkes was given £1,000 to commission a memorial, and he approached the French sculptor Rouilliac. The marble statue created, and the later one for the Duke's widow, are widely thought to be among the most impressive in England and reside in Walkton Church in Northamptonshire. You can see it here. A child assists in hanging a medallion of the Duke, assisted by Charity, while his grieving widow looks on, and all around are trophies of arms representing his military career. The child may represent the Duke's son, who did not survive him. Montagu's title then became extinct. His daughter Mary inherited his estates, and her husband was later created the next first Duke of Montagu. But again in 1790, this second creation of the dukedom became extinct. I'd like to close with a quote from just after his death, made by someone writing in the Spectator magazine of 1753 after witnessing this memorial and the later one to his widow. "These monuments shall be wept over, when the Duke and Duchess shall be forgotten, if it is in the power of time to obliterate the memory of his Grace's charities and of her beauty." He is forgotten now, this man of humanity and good humour, eminent in so many ways, modern in some, and of his time in others. He's fallen between the cracks of history. Today, you can look at his tomb, visit his home at Boughton as a tourist and marvel at the tree-lined avenues that he created, or walk to the shore at Buckler's and ponder his failed colonial ambitions. And I hope that some of you who have heard this talk tonight or on our YouTube channel will think sometimes in his tercentenary year as Grand Master of John the Planter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Bravo. Very, very interesting. If you have a question for Mark, then please post it in the chat. We will give you a bit of time to type there. Mark, goodness me, what a character.
That isn't the half of it. There's plenty more jokes and all sorts.
I have to start with this question, though. Please forgive me here, but let me just try and see if I can summarize this a little bit. This is almost too extraordinary. Now, if you happen to be a duke, you happen to be the owner of a lion, an obsessive hunter of trees, you're quite a practical joker, you are, well, into scientific experiments being carried out at your home, you do lots of charity work. I mean, even your own mother-in-law expresses quite a bit of, let's say, concern about your character, and yet he seems to have been immensely popular. I mean, forgive me here, but the word eccentric springs to mind, Mark. How was he viewed? I mean, apart from his mother-in-law there, how was this character viewed at the time? It must have been rather extraordinary.
It was, but he does seem to have been very respected. And bear in mind, Georgian society, particularly under the early Georges, is very small. The aristocracy is not that large. The monarchy's only just changed over. He's really on the great pivot of history. It could still go the other way. He's backing the new regime. But it's also the time when a lot of charities get going, the learned societies begin, cafe culture. It's unique. It's the time really when Freemasonry is born, when, because you're in Britain, particularly England and London, you're allowed to form clubs, you're allowed to form societies, you're allowed to do whatever you like. There's no such thing as specialism. That comes much later. You want to be a scientist? Fine, go ahead and be a scientist. But you're bored with that? Go be an artist? Yes, do that too. And all the time, don't forget to drink at least several bottles of port a day because you're an Englishman. I love that early period, and it's very much forgotten. George IV, of course, barely spoke any English, first spoke nearly no English. And George II still saw himself very much as an elector of Hanover, more than King of England. But his was a very, very liberal time in England. And of course, I didn't mention during the talk that his son, the Prince of Wales, became a Freemason. But unfortunately, George II and his son didn't get on at all. And the son died in an accident. So otherwise, he might have been the first king to have been a Freemason. So it's an amazing world.
Can I ask you, Mark, do we know anything more about his educational background? I mean, who influenced him? Do we know anything about his father?
His father was banished because he got packed the wrong side in the Monmouth Rebellion. His father was an absolute disaster area, but very successful. He got to be a duke, although actually it was really only after his son took up with Marlborough's daughter that Ralph got his dukedom. And I do think Marlborough just said, look, we can't have the lad without a title. I mean, I know he's Lord Monmouth, but really. So actually, it's one hell of a flip. I mean, you always sort of think of, Prince Hal and Falstaff, that he was busying himself. And again, he was an amazing joker. And his wife, of course, well, mother-in-law's quote again. Mary has made you a cuckold, your daughter a whore, and your niece a bawd. I mean, if you marry into the Marlborough family, they don't mince words, really.
Good point. Mark, a question for you in the chat. Do we know of which lodge he was a member?
No, because he almost seems to have bypassed the lodge system, because he was probably made a Freemason at sight by Desaguliers. Though I think he was in number 4. Now that I say that, I believe he was in number 4.
Okay, very good, interesting. Mark, the monument there at the end you showed us, I mean, that's quite extraordinary as well. And there must be quite a few hidden symbols there, I imagine. Do we know anything more about that one?
There's nothing as far as I can see with Freemasonry in it. And yes, quite right, he was in Royal Somerset House and Inverness number 4, which probably I should have put in the middle of the talk. Will do next time I do it. It's very much his wider life. I mean, his eccentricities are not there. I mean, interestingly, Mary didn't know what was going to be produced. She just gave folks £1,000 to go and do it. I don't want to know. So he's got the grief of the widow, charity, and him in the middle with some trophies of arms, because truthfully, his military career was very slight. But you would see formal portraits in armour, as was the tradition in the first half of the century.
Very good. A question in connection to that, Mark, in the chat. Was he a patron to any artists? Was he involved in art in any way?
Not as far as I can see. That doesn't seem to be his thing. It seems to be very much charity, caring of people, understanding the world. That seems to be more his thing. And again, you only have to look at the fact he didn't finish Boughton. He was busily planting trees, didn't care the fact that one entire wing was hollow.
That's an interesting point, actually. What was it about that wing? What was that?
Well, the house was asymmetrical. It was meant by his father to be a version of Versailles, because everybody who visited Versailles when it was built wanted one. Unfortunately, of course, Versailles was the first. So you very often find when Marlborough's house is a bit like Versailles, only bigger. But again, he seems to be. It's now actually got another thing. If you ever look at the Canaleta of the Thames facing towards the city, you can see another one of his houses, and you can just see a little pagoda thing sticking out by the river, and that's still in the unfinished wing. Why? I don't know. Blokes like a shed, and maybe he just wanted a pagoda. So there's all these sort of other angles on him, and his sense of humour was mostly benign, but it could get him into trouble. One of the other great things he did, one of his friends was a master of ceremonies at one of the pleasure gardens in London, and he got the guy drunk, moulded his face, and made a wax mask. And then when the cap came in, he called for the dance, and then when he disappeared, somebody wearing his face came in and shouted, "God save the Jacobites," and "Body Prince Charlie." And this went on and on and on until the poor man came face to face with himself, nearly died of fright, and then promptly decided to draw his sword and pretty much challenge Montague to a duel. So I don't know. No, really, it was meant to be funny. And they did patch it up after a while, but Heidegger actually insisted on seeing the mask broken in front of his face to be quite sure that it wasn't going to happen again.
Goodness me. Oh, goodness me. Interesting point there about art, Mark, but how was his relationship to science? Because you did mention a few scientists there in his company.
He seems to have had a fascination. He collected scientific instruments. He did allow experiments in Montague House, and I think about, and particularly with electricity. How much he understood of any of this is unclear. but he had a great curiosity, and certainly hanging around the Royal Society at that period, you've got some of the best brains of the time around you. As for his other fellowships, he approached the College of Physicians, oddly enough. He wanted to be a fellow. He had a degree from Cambridge, which in the way of the aristocracy, you only had to turn up and you would be given a degree. But he seemed to be active. He seemed to want to know. But obviously he never practiced as a physician. But then the number of qualifications of that period were pretty slight anyway. And again, I think it's fascinating that he went to those lectures, which would have been all in Latin. So clearly his education was pretty good.
Mark, now this was, of course, a very brief talk, but was there anything, well, apart from what you've already mentioned, interesting in your research that you came about that you haven't had a chance to mention?
I could elaborate a lot on Montagu's Carboneers, which he raised, and indeed the whole way he ran Boughton, because when I did this talk, when I started getting quite keen on Montagu, which was a long while ago, about 18 years, there wasn't much out in print. There was a book called The Montagues of Boughton, which was 1888, I think, and that was it. There's now two very good articles, one in the Transactions of the Research Lodge Capta Coronati. I've lent on that for some of the quotes, quite shamelessly. But I did go into the Northamptonshire Record, and you're starting to see what he's spending his money on, and you're starting to see his charities, and you're starting to get a sense of where this immense wealth is channeling. And I could have done more than that. I think you've got most of the silly joke stories and practical jokes. Although again, there's all sorts of people being basically dunked up to their neck in water. That's another famous Freemason we won't go into here. The other thing that we couldn't do tonight is to put him more in context of the time he was in. Because when you put him into the first half of the 18th century, he's the perfect vehicle for telling the story because he's everywhere. He's everywhere, eminent in so many ways and preeminent in none of them. That's why he's been completely forgotten. Look around, look, it's John Montagu again. But he's dividing, his strengths and his interests so much. He never hangs around in one place for very long.
Interesting details there, Mark. So that's a hard question, isn't it? Because he seems to have been forgotten a bit and not much have been written. Where, you mentioned a few sources there, but where can people start if they want to know more about him or find out more about him?
Really, the best two things of this, I say the Capta Coronati article is probably the best biography. And if you web search him, he'll turn up. But he only turns up as an odd shards. There's a site on slavery in the West Midlands, and he's one of the people who comes up. And it's interesting, they also, even in this particular year, they're very even-handed about him because he's such a contradiction. He's doing this, but he's also doing that. So he's also breaks surface. If you go onto the Boughton website, they have some resources, and they do mention the lion. There's a rather nice children's trail where you have to work out questions about the lion. So I rather hope he gets better known. He deserves a biographer one day.
Definitely, yes.
And again, his relationship with Horace Walpole. We've just got that one wonderful quote about the cat. But again, you see, he's friends of a diarist, and I must admit, gone through the Walpole diaries to see if there's any other references to him, oblique ones. And there's more work to be done again about that foundation stone, because that journal entry is the only reference to it. And of course, if he did lay it, it's at exactly the point when he sent the constitutions to the printers, so it's not going to be in there. But I really want to know, was it him or was it his great rival Wharton who took over? Because if it's him, it's doubling in spades a Hanoverian thing as well. That's great. 2 foundation stones. If it turns out to be Wharton, of course, who hadn't officially become Grand Master by that point, then it's 1 Hanoverian, 1 Jacobite, and it kind of neuters things. So there's all sorts of things one might explore with him. And this really has been going back to some of my early research, reading up more that's been published more recently. But there still isn't really as much about him as he deserves.
A quick one in the chat, Mark, about why didn't he go on Grand Tour?
I don't think his father let him. I don't think his father had the money. He just seems to have been kept in Montagu House. To some extent, there's one school of thought which actually, in a sense, his Grand Tour was going out with the army, but he definitely didn't didn't really seem to like it. I mean, it was the logical thing for a young man. Yeah, but again, you just imagine he got his education, and you'd think, how the hell did he manage it? Because there's no sense of him being tutored or anything else. I mean, Ralph's house was a complete madhouse, as far as one can tell. And again, this is another interesting thing which I'd like to probe. There's a thing called the Gormagans, which was set up by Wharton, or hijacked by Wharton, and there's a wonderful procession of the Gormagans, which is pretty much ridiculing Grand Lodge and absolutely everything in it. Everybody's there. Anderson's there, we think. Wharton's in there, and they say the Gormagans were formed by the Emperor of China before the birth of Adam. Now, if we reckon he's taking the mickey out of the Premier Grand Lodge, he's saying you were formed by the Emperor of China. Who's the hereditary Emperor of China? John Montagu, if his dad was the emperor before him. So are they saying that John founded Grand Lodge and it's the 1720-21 date, not 1717? Might just throw that out there, but I'm not taking sides.
Oh, intriguing. Mark, we are running out of time, but thank you so much for bringing him to life again. There's definitely a book there, isn't there?
If there's a biographer in the audience,
definitely
go get him. You can have my notes.
Mark, thank you so much. We are running out of time now, but a huge thank you for this talk, Mark, and thanks to Louise for technical support tonight, and of course thank you to all of you for joining us and for your questions. We will be back on Tuesday the 25th of May at 7:30 p.m. British time with our archivist Susan Snell for a talk about our new special exhibition at the museum. It's featuring the famous dentist and Freemason Bartholomew Ruspini. So please join us for that one. He was another interesting character indeed. The link to register is already available on our website. For now, thank you so much for joining us and enjoy your evening.